I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life I believed that being a good mother meant giving everything. No matter the cost. No matter how much it hurt. No matter how invisible I became inside my own home, until one day I woke up and realized something terrifying. My son wasn't just living with me anymore. He was controlling my life, my time, my energy, and I had allowed it to happen slowly, quietly, year after year. I raised my son alone. His father left when he was still young, and from that moment on, I made a silent promise to myself that he would never feel abandoned, never feel lacking, never feel like he didn't have someone fighting for him. So I worked longer hours, sacrificed my own dreams, gave up relationships, and poured everything I had into making sure he was safe, comfortable, and loved. But what I didn't realize back then was that love without limits can slowly turn into something else. Something that traps you. As the years went by, I kept telling myself that things would change, that he would grow, mature, take responsibility. That one day he would look at me and say, "Mom, you've done enough, now let me take care of you." But that day never came. Instead, something else happened. Something much harder to admit. He got comfortable. Too comfortable, and I became the one paying the price. I'm 62 years old, and if there's one thing I always believed about myself, it was that I was a good mother, the kind of mother who gives everything, who sacrifices without complaining, who stays strong even when no one is watching. And for most of my life, that belief guided every decision I made, every choice, every moment where I put someone else before myself, especially my son, because from the day he was born, I made a promise that I would never let him feel alone, never let him struggle the way I did, never let life be harder for him than it needed to be. I raised him alone after his father left, and that kind of responsibility changes you. It makes you stronger in some ways, but it also makes you more vulnerable in others, because when you carry everything on your shoulders, you start believing that you have to keep carrying it forever, that if you stop, everything will fall apart. And so I worked harder, gave more, protected him more, and slowly, without even realizing it, I built a life where he never truly had to face anything on his own. At first, it felt like love, pure and simple. I would wake up early, prepare his meals, make sure everything was ready for him, make his life easier in every possible way. And I told myself that this is what a mother does, this is what love looks like, and maybe it is at the beginning. But what I didn't understand back then was that love, when it has no limits, when it never says no, when it never creates boundaries, can slowly turn into something else. Something that doesn't help, something that holds back. Years passed, and instead of becoming more independent, he became more comfortable, more used to having everything done for him, more used to not needing to try, and I started noticing small things, little details that didn't seem important at first, like how he would wake up later each day, how he would leave things unfinished, how he would always have a reason for not taking responsibility, and every time I noticed it, I told myself it was temporary, that he was just going through a phase, that things would change soon. But soon never came, and those small things didn't stay small. They grew slowly but steadily, turning into habits, patterns that repeated themselves day after day, until one day I realized that this wasn't a phase anymore, this was his life. And somehow it had also become mine, a life where I was constantly giving and he was constantly taking, without either of us questioning it. I remember one morning very clearly. I had been awake since early, cleaning the house, organizing everything, trying to keep things in order like I always did, and when he finally woke up close to noon, he walked into the kitchen, looked at the table, and instead of saying good morning, instead of asking how I was, he simply said, "Is this all there is to eat?" And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not in a loud or dramatic way, but quietly, like a small crack forming where everything once felt solid. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it, the tone, the expectation, the complete absence of awareness that someone had woken up hours earlier to prepare that meal, that someone had spent years making sure he never lacked anything, and yet, to him, it wasn't enough. And that's when I started to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet discomfort, a realization that something wasn't right. And still, even with that feeling growing inside me, even with that small crack beginning to expand, I did what I had always done. I stayed silent, I adjusted. I told myself it wasn't worth creating conflict, that it was easier to just let it go, because that's what I had trained myself to do for years. To endure, to give, to stay quiet, without realizing that every moment of silence was slowly building the life I was now trapped in. At first, I told myself that it was just a phase, something temporary, something that would pass with time, because that's what we do when we don't want to face the truth. We soften it, we delay it, we wrap it in hope so we don't have to confront what's right in front of us. And for a while, that illusion worked. It allowed me to keep going, to keep giving, to keep believing that one day things would simply fall into place without me having to change anything. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift in a way I could no longer ignore. It wasn't just about him waking up late or avoiding responsibilities anymore. It was about the way he started to carry himself inside the house, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at me, like everything around him existed for his comfort, like the house wasn't something we shared, but something that belonged to him. He didn't need to raise his voice to impose himself, and maybe that's what made it harder to recognize, because there were no obvious signs of conflict, no shouting, no dramatic arguments, just a quiet, constant pressure, subtle behaviors that slowly shifted the balance of the house, until one day I realized that I wasn't making decisions based on what I needed anymore. I was making decisions based on how he would react. If I thought about cooking something simple, I would stop myself and think, he's not going to like that. So I would change it. If I wanted to rest, I would think about whether he might need something, so I would stay up. If I considered asking him for help, I would already anticipate the sigh, the annoyance, the resistance. And before even saying a word, I would give up, choosing silence over discomfort. And that's how control really works. Not through force, but through anticipation, through the quiet adjustment of your behavior to avoid tension, through the slow erosion of your own needs until they no longer feel as important, and without realizing it, I had started living around him, shaping my days, my choices, my energy, all to maintain a fragile sense of peace that wasn't really peace at all. There were moments when I tried to push back, small attempts, almost timid, like asking him to help with something simple around the house or suggesting that he look for work again. But every time I did, he had a response ready, something that made me question myself, something that shifted the focus back onto me, like, it's not that easy right now, or, why are you always pressuring me? And somehow, those words always made me retreat. I began to notice a pattern, one that was difficult to admit because it forced me to see things I didn't want to see. Every time I tried to create a boundary, he would respond in a way that made me feel guilty, like I was being unfair, like I was asking too much, like I was somehow failing as a mother, and that feeling, that quiet guilt, was enough to keep me from insisting. And so, little by little, without any big confrontation, without any clear moment where everything changed, I found myself in a position I never thought I would be in, living in my own house, but no longer feeling like it was mine, giving everything I had, but receiving less and less in return. And still, despite everything I was beginning to see, despite the growing discomfort, despite the quiet voice inside me starting to question it all, I stayed silent. The house didn't change overnight, the walls were still the same, the furniture was still in the same place, the routines looked familiar from the outside. But something inside that space had shifted in a way I couldn't explain at first. It was subtle, almost invisible, like a quiet heaviness that followed me from room to room, a feeling that I was no longer moving freely inside my own home, that every step I took was somehow influenced by him, by his presence, by his mood. I started noticing how I would pause before doing simple things that used to be natural, effortless, like turning on the TV, making a phone call, even choosing what to cook, because in the back of my mind there was always the same question. How is he going to react? And that question, repeated day after day, slowly changed the way I lived, until I wasn't acting based on what I wanted anymore, but on what would avoid tension. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, a silence that builds pressure instead of releasing it. And that's the kind of silence that began to fill my house. We could go hours without speaking, sometimes entire days with only a few words exchanged. But even in that silence, there was something present, something unspoken, something that made me feel constantly aware, constantly alert, like I was living with someone I had to be careful around. I remember sitting in the living room one afternoon, the light coming through the window, everything looking calm on the surface, and yet inside me there was this growing discomfort, this quiet question that kept repeating itself. When did I start feeling like a guest in my own home? And I didn't have an answer, because it hadn't happened all at once. It had happened slowly, in moments I didn't even notice at the time. I began to lose small parts of myself without realizing it, things I used to enjoy, habits that once made me feel like me. They started disappearing, not because I made a decision to stop, but because there was no space for them anymore, no energy left. Everything was directed toward maintaining the house, maintaining the routine, maintaining him. And somewhere in that process I stopped maintaining myself. Even the way I spoke changed. I became more careful with my words, softer, more cautious, choosing what to say and what not to say, avoiding anything that might create discomfort. And that kind of constant self-monitoring does something to you. It wears you down. It makes you smaller, quieter, until one day you realize that you're not expressing yourself anymore. You're managing reactions. And the hardest part was that from the outside, nothing looked wrong. If someone visited, they would see a normal house, a mother and her adult son living together, no visible conflict, no obvious problem. And maybe that's why I stayed in that situation for so long, because there was nothing dramatic enough to justify a breaking point, nothing that made it clear that something was deeply wrong. But deep down, I could feel it. And still, I said nothing. There's a kind of realization that doesn't come all at once. It doesn't hit you like a shock or a sudden awakening. It arrives quietly, almost like a whisper in the back of your mind, repeating itself over and over until you can no longer ignore it. And that's exactly what started happening to me. Small thoughts that I used to push away began to stay longer, to grow stronger, to demand attention in a way they never had before. At first, it was just a question that appeared from time to time, simple but uncomfortable. Is this really how I'm going to live the rest of my life? And every time that thought came up, I would immediately try to silence it, to distract myself, to focus on something else, because answering it honestly meant facing something I wasn't ready to face, something that would require change. And change is never easy when you've been living the same way for years. But the mind doesn't forget what it has already seen. Once you start noticing something, you can't go back to not seeing it. And that question, that simple question, started appearing more often in different moments, while I was cleaning, while I was cooking, while I was sitting alone. And each time it came back, it felt heavier, more present, less avoidable. I began to look at my life differently, not as something I was simply living day by day, but as something that had a direction, a path that I was unconsciously following. And when I looked ahead, when I imagined the years passing without anything changing, I felt something tighten inside my chest, a quiet fear, not of him, but of myself, of what I was allowing, of what I was accepting as normal. Because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. This wasn't just about helping my son anymore. This wasn't just about being patient or understanding. This was about a pattern that had taken over my life, a dynamic where I gave and he received, where I adjusted and he remained the same, where I carried everything and he carried nothing, and somehow that had become our normal. I started remembering who I used to be before all of this, before the years of constant giving, before the silent adjustments, before the quiet sacrifices that no one saw. And I realized that I had changed in ways I hadn't even noticed, not just in what I did, but in how I felt about myself, in how much space I allowed myself to have in my own life. There was a moment late at night when the house was completely silent and I was sitting alone, and I remember thinking, when was the last time I chose something just because I wanted to? And I couldn't answer, because every decision I made seemed to be connected to him in some way, shaped by his needs, his preferences, his reactions. And that's when the thought changed. It stopped being just a question about the future, and became something more direct, more personal, more difficult to ignore. What if the problem isn't just what he's doing, but what I keep allowing? And that thought stayed with me, heavier than anything else, because it didn't point outward, it pointed back at me. And even with all that clarity beginning to form, even with that uncomfortable truth starting to take shape inside me, I still didn't act. Because understanding something is not the same as having the courage to change it. Once that thought settled in my mind, it didn't leave. It followed me through the day, through the smallest moments, through the silence of the house and the noise of my own routine. And no matter how much I tried to return to the way things were, to that quiet acceptance I had lived in for so long, something had changed inside me, something had woken up, and it was no longer willing to go back to sleep. I started paying attention in a different way, not just to him but to myself, to the way I reacted, to the way I adjusted, to the way I automatically put him first without even questioning it. And once you begin to observe yourself like that, with honesty instead of habit, you begin to see patterns that were always there but never fully acknowledged, patterns that reveal more than you're ready to admit. I noticed how quickly I would respond when he called me, how I would stop what I was doing, no matter what it was, just to attend to him, as if his needs were always urgent, always more important. And I asked myself something I had never asked before: what would happen if I didn't respond right away? And even thinking about that made me feel uncomfortable, almost anxious, like I was doing something wrong. That discomfort told me everything I needed to know. Because when doing something for yourself feels wrong, it means you've been living for someone else for too long. There was one moment that stayed with me, something small, almost insignificant on the surface, but powerful in what it revealed. He called me from his room, asking for something. I don't even remember what it was, and for a second, just a second, I didn't move. I stayed where I was, And in that brief pause, I felt something unfamiliar, something I hadn't felt in years: space. It was only a few seconds, but in those seconds I realized how automatic my life had become, how I moved without thinking, how I reacted without choosing, and that tiny moment of stillness showed me something I couldn't ignore anymore. I had been living on autopilot, repeating the same patterns, the same responses, the same silence, over and over again. Of course, I got up right after. I went to him like I always did. I gave him what he asked for, and everything continued exactly the same on the outside, but inside, something had shifted, because now I knew that I had a choice. Even if I wasn't ready to make it yet, I had seen the possibility of doing something different. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The routine didn't change that day, or the next, or the next. But the awareness stayed, growing quietly, like something building beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough, when understanding would finally turn into action. And even though I didn't know when that moment would come, I could feel it getting closer. The more aware I became, the harder it was to ignore the details that had once seemed normal. Things that I used to overlook now stood out in a way that made me uncomfortable, like they were demanding to be seen. And it wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that would shock someone from the outside. It was the repetition, the consistency, the quiet certainty that nothing would change unless I did something about it. I started noticing how he moved through the house as if everything was already taken care of, as if meals would appear without effort, as if clothes would always be clean, as if bills would always be paid. And there was something about that certainty that began to bother me more than anything else, not because he expected it, but because he had never been given a reason not to. One afternoon I was in the kitchen preparing lunch, doing what I had done thousands of times before, following the same routine, the same movements, and I remember looking at my hands as I worked, thinking about how many years they had spent doing the same thing, giving, providing, maintaining, and for the first time, instead of feeling proud of that, I felt tired, deeply tired. Not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper, like something inside me had been running for too long without rest, like I had been carrying a weight I never stopped to question. And now that I was finally looking at it, really looking at it, I could see how heavy it had become. He walked into the kitchen like he always did, casually, without urgency, without awareness, opened the fridge, looked inside, closed it, and then turned to me and asked, "Is lunch ready?" And it wasn't the question itself that affected me, it was the absence of anything else, no greeting, no acknowledgement, no sense that someone had been standing there, preparing that meal for him. And in that moment, something inside me didn't react the way it used to. I didn't answer immediately. It was a small pause, barely noticeable from the outside, just a few seconds of silence, but inside, it felt different. It felt intentional, like for the first time I wasn't just responding automatically, I was choosing whether or not to respond. He looked at me, slightly confused, maybe even a little annoyed, and repeated the question, and that's when I realized something important, something that had always been there but I had never allowed myself to see clearly. He wasn't asking because he needed to know, he was asking because he expected everything to revolve around him. And for the first time in a long time, felt something shift. Not action, not yet. But something was no longer the same. That small pause stayed with me longer than I expected. It replayed in my mind throughout the day, not because of what happened on the outside, but because of what it revealed on the inside. It showed me that for the first time I had interrupted the pattern, even if just for a few seconds, even if nothing had changed yet, something inside me had stopped reacting automatically. And that was new. The rest of the day continued like any other. He went back to his room, I finished preparing lunch, the house remained quiet, everything looked normal on the surface, but inside me, there was a growing awareness that made everything feel slightly different, like I was watching my own life from a distance, noticing details I had ignored for years. I started to see how predictable everything had become, how every interaction followed the same script. He would ask, I would respond, he would expect, I would provide, and that cycle repeated itself so many times that it no longer required thought. It had become automatic, almost mechanical, and that realization brought with it a quiet discomfort that I couldn't shake. Later that evening I found myself sitting in the same place I always sat, in the same silence I had grown used to, but this time instead of accepting it, I observed it, I listened to it, and I realized that the silence wasn't peaceful. It was empty, it carried no connection, no exchange, no presence, just two people living in the same space, but in completely separate worlds. I began to question something deeper, something I had never fully allowed myself to confront. When did we stop being mother and son and become something else? And that question stayed with me, because it forced me to see that what we had now wasn't just a phase or a situation. It was a dynamic that had replaced the relationship we once had. There was no gratitude, no mutual care, no sense of shared responsibility, just a quiet imbalance that had settled into our daily lives, one where I gave and he received, one where I adapted and he remained the same, and the more I saw it, the harder it became to pretend that everything was fine. That night I didn't sleep well. Not because of noise, not because of anything external, but because my mind wouldn't settle. It kept returning to the same thoughts, the same realizations, the same uncomfortable clarity that had been building inside me. And for the first time I couldn't push it away, I couldn't silence it. Because once the truth becomes clear, silence is no longer enough to hold it back. The next morning didn't feel like the others, even though everything looked exactly the same light coming through the window, the same quiet house, the same routine waiting to be repeated, but inside me, there was something different, something I couldn't ignore anymore, like a pressure that had been building for too long and was now reaching a point where it could no longer stay contained. I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because my mind was already awake, already moving, already revisiting everything I had started to see. And as I sat there in the silence of the morning, I realized that the life I had been living was no longer invisible to me. I could see it clearly now, the patterns, the imbalance, the quiet way I had disappeared inside my own home. For years I had told myself that things would change on their own, that time would fix it, that he would eventually grow, mature, take responsibility, but now, that belief felt empty because the truth was simple and undeniable. Nothing changes when there's no reason for it to change, and I had removed every reason he ever had to become independent. I went into the kitchen and started preparing breakfast, the same movements, the same routine, but this time I was aware of every action, every step, every decision, and instead of feeling automatic, it felt deliberate, like I was watching myself from the outside, noticing how deeply ingrained these habits had become. When he woke up and walked into the kitchen, everything unfolded exactly as it always did. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just a quiet expectation that everything would already be in place, and for a moment, I watched it happen without reacting, without stepping in immediately, just observing the scene as if I were seeing it for the first time. He looked at the table, then at me, and asked something simple, something ordinary, but this time, instead of responding instantly, I paused again, not out of confusion, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, and in that pause I could feel something shifting inside me, something that had been growing for days now, becoming stronger, more present. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was clarity. And clarity has a way of changing everything, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a quiet, undeniable way that makes it impossible to go back to the way things were before, because once you see something clearly, you can't pretend you didn't. And in that moment, for the first time, I realized that something was going to change. Not because of him, but because of me. That realization didn't explode into action, it didn't turn into a dramatic confrontation or a sudden change overnight. Instead, it settled quietly inside me, like a decision that hadn't fully taken shape yet, but was already influencing the way I moved, the way I thought, the way I responded, and even though nothing had changed on the outside, something fundamental had shifted within me. The rest of that morning continued as usual, at least from his perspective. He ate, went back to his room, closed the door, and disappeared into his world like he always did, unaware that anything had changed, unaware that the person who had been silently supporting that routine for years was no longer the same. But for me, every small moment felt different. When I washed the dishes, I noticed the weight of the routine, not physically, but emotionally, like I was finally aware of how repetitive, how unbalanced everything had become. And instead of accepting it as normal, I began to question it with a clarity I had never allowed myself to have before. I looked around the house at the things I maintained, the spaces I kept in order, the life I sustained day after day, and for the first time I didn't feel pride. I felt something closer to awareness, an understanding that all of this had been built on a pattern that no longer made sense for me, a pattern that had quietly taken more than it gave. There was a moment later that afternoon when he called me from his room again, the same tone, the same expectation, the same assumption that I would respond immediately, and I felt that familiar impulse to get up, to go to him without thinking. But this time I didn't move. Not right away. I stayed where I was. And in that pause, something powerful happened. I realized that nothing would collapse if I didn't respond immediately. The house didn't fall apart. The world didn't end. The silence remained. And for the first time, I allowed it to remain. He called again, a little louder this time, a little more impatient, and I could feel the old pattern trying to pull me back in, the habit, the automatic response, the version of me that had always gotten up without question. But now there was something else present, something stronger. Awareness. And awareness creates space. And in that space, for the first time in years, chose not to move. Not out of anger. Not out of rebellion. But because something inside me was finally beginning to understand. That change doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with interruption. At first, he didn't react the way I expected. There was no immediate confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic shift in tone, just a subtle change in his presence, something almost imperceptible to anyone else, but very clear to me, like he was trying to process what had just happened, like a pattern he had relied on for years had suddenly failed to respond the way it always did, and for a brief moment, he didn't know how to adjust. He stayed in his room for a while after calling me, longer than usual, and I could feel a quiet tension building in the house. Not loud, not chaotic, but present, like something unspoken was moving between the walls, something that hadn't existed before, because for the first time I hadn't followed the script, I hadn't responded automatically, and that small break had created a space neither of us knew how to fill yet. Eventually, he came out, walking into the living room where I was sitting, and I could sense it in the way he moved, in the way he paused for a second before speaking, like he was observing me differently, trying to understand if what had happened was intentional or just a coincidence. And that moment, that simple act of him standing there without immediately speaking, felt heavier than any argument we could have had. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that revealed more than the words themselves, something that carried expectation and confusion at the same time, and he said, "Didn't you hear me?" As if the idea that I might have heard him and chosen not to respond didn't fully exist as a possibility in his mind. And for the first time in years I didn't rush to explain, I didn't fill the silence with justifications, I didn't soften the moment to make it more comfortable for him, I simply looked at him and said, "I heard you." And those 3 words, simple as they were, carried something different this time. Not resistance, not anger, but presence, a quiet clarity that didn't need to defend itself. He stood there for a moment, waiting, maybe expecting me to continue, to add something, to return to the familiar pattern where I would explain, adjust, or give in, but I didn't. I remained still, grounded in that moment, allowing the silence to exist without trying to control it, and that silence began to stretch, becoming something neither of us could ignore. I could see it in his expression, not anger, not yet, but confusion, a subtle discomfort that came from not getting the response he was used to, from encountering something unfamiliar in a place that had always been predictable, and that confusion told me something important, something I hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't used to me having boundaries. And in that realization, there was something equally clear. I wasn't used to holding them. But that moment, quiet and simple as it was, marked a shift that couldn't be undone, because once a pattern breaks, even in the smallest way, it creates a new possibility, a new dynamic, something that begins to grow whether you're ready for it or not. And standing there in that silence, I knew that something had started, and it wasn't going back. That moment didn't end when he walked away. It stayed in the air long after he returned to his room, like something invisible had been set in motion, something that neither of us fully understood yet, but could both feel. And as I sat there in the quiet of the living room, I realized that this wasn't just about that one interaction, it was about what it represented, a break in a pattern that had defined our lives for years. For him, it may have seemed like something small, something insignificant, but for me it carried weight because it showed me that I was capable of doing something different, that I wasn't as trapped in that routine as I had believed. And that realization brought with it a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just steady, like something inside me had finally aligned. But change doesn't happen without resistance. Later that day I began to notice it in small ways, subtle shifts in his behavior that might have gone unnoticed before, but now stood out clearly, like the way he moved through the house with a slightly different energy, like he was paying more attention, like he was trying to understand what had changed and how to respond to it. At one point, he walked into the kitchen again, opened the fridge, stood there for a few seconds, and then closed it without taking anything, and instead of asking me a direct question like he usually did, he said something more indirect, something that sounded casual on the surface but carried a familiar expectation underneath, something like, "There's nothing ready, huh?" It wasn't a question. It was a test. A way of seeing if I would step in, if I would fill the gap, if I would return to the role I had always played without needing to be asked directly. And I could feel that old impulse rising again, that automatic reaction to fix, to provide, to restore the comfort he was used to. But this time I didn't move. I looked at him, calmly, without tension, without confrontation, and simply said, If you're hungry, you can make something. And even as the words left my mouth, I could feel how different they were from anything I had said before, not because they were harsh, but because they carried something new, responsibility. He didn't respond immediately. There was a pause. And in that pause, I could feel it, a shift, not just in me, but in him too. 'Cause for the first time, I wasn't removing the weight from his shoulders. I was placing it back where it belonged. He didn't like that answer, not because it was aggressive or unfair, but because it didn't fit into the structure he had always relied on. It didn't give him what he expected, it didn't remove the discomfort, and for a moment I could see it in his face, that subtle shift, that internal resistance that comes when something familiar suddenly stops working the way it always has. He looked at me, not with anger, not yet, but with something closer to disbelief, like he was trying to decide if I was serious or if this was just a temporary reaction, something that would fade if he waited long enough. And that look told me more than any words could have. It revealed how deeply rooted that dynamic had become, how certain he was that things would always go back to the way they were. But I didn't move. I didn't soften it. I didn't step in to fix it. I simply stayed where I was, calm, present, allowing the moment to exist without trying to control it. And that stillness created something new between us, something unfamiliar, something that neither of us had experienced before. Responsibility hanging in the air, waiting to be claimed. He eventually turned away, not saying anything else, and for the first time, instead of going back to his room and waiting for things to be done for him, he stayed in the kitchen, standing there for a moment, as if he was deciding what to do next, and that moment, simple as it was, carried more meaning than anything that had happened before. Because for the first time, he had to choose. And I wasn't going to choose for him. I went back to what I was doing, not in a cold or distant way, but in a grounded, intentional way, like I was reclaiming my space without needing to announce it, without needing to justify it. And even though the house was quiet, there was something different in that silence, something that felt less heavy, less controlled. After a while, I heard small sounds coming from the kitchen, cabinets opening, things moving, the quiet noise of someone figuring something out on their own. And those sounds, ordinary as they were, carried something powerful, something that hadn't existed in that house for a long time. Autonomy. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about pushing him away. It wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about creating distance. It was about restoring balance. Something that had been missing for years. And even though this was just the beginning, I could feel it. Things were changing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that couldn't be undone. That shift didn't go unnoticed, even though nothing had been said directly, even though there had been no argument, no confrontation, no clear line drawn between what was before and what was now. Something in the atmosphere of the house had changed, and he could feel it, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. At first, his reaction wasn't loud. It didn't come in the form of anger or direct conflict. It came through small changes in behavior, subtle but intentional, like the way he moved with a bit more tension, the way he closed doors a little harder than necessary, the way he lingered in spaces longer than usual, as if waiting for me to step in, to fix something, to return to the role I had always played. There was a distance in the way he interacted with me, not silence, but something close to it, fewer words, shorter responses, less engagement, and I could sense what was underneath that behavior, not just confusion, but discomfort, the kind that comes when someone is forced to face something they've never had to deal with before, responsibility. One evening, he sat across from me in the living room, something that hadn't happened in a while, and there was a pause before he spoke, like he was choosing his words carefully, and then he said, "You've been acting different." And the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it was the first time he acknowledged the shift out loud. I looked at him, not defensively, not with tension, but with a calm I didn't have before, and I said, "I am." And I didn't add anything else, I didn't explain, I didn't justify, I didn't soften it, because for the first time, I didn't feel the need to make it easier for him to accept. He frowned slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, like he was trying to understand what that meant, like he was searching for the version of me he was used to. The one who would fill the silence, who would explain everything, who would make things comfortable again, but that version of me wasn't there anymore. And that's when the tension became clearer. Not explosive, not aggressive, but undeniable. Because for the first time, he couldn't predict me. And when someone loses that sense of control, even if they never realize they had it, something inside them reacts, something begins to push back, to test, to question, to resist the change that is happening. But this time, I wasn't going to adjust to that reaction. I wasn't going to return to the pattern just to restore comfort. 'Cause now, I could see it clearly. And once you see something clearly, you don't go back to pretending you don't. The tension didn't explode into something obvious. It didn't turn into a loud argument or a dramatic confrontation, but it became impossible to ignore. It settled into the space between us, present in every interaction, in every silence, in every look that lasted just a little longer than before. And for the first time, I could feel that he wasn't just noticing the change. He was reacting to it. It started with small remarks, subtle at first, almost disguised as casual observations, things like, "You've been weird lately," or, "I don't know what's going on with you." And on the surface they sounded harmless, but underneath there was something else, something that carried expectation, something that was trying to pull me back into the role I had always played without directly asking me to return to it. In the past, those kinds of comments would have affected me. They would have made me question myself, made me soften, made me explain, made me adjust. But this time, they didn't land the same way because I could see what they really were, not just words, but attempts to restore a dynamic that no longer existed in the same way. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to convince him of anything. I simply remained consistent. And consistency is something that disrupts patterns more than anything else. There was one moment, late in the afternoon, when the tension became more visible. He walked into the room with a certain energy, not aggressive, but charged, like he had been holding something in and was finally ready to express it, and he looked at me and said, "I don't understand why you're acting like this all of a sudden." And for a brief moment there was silence. Not the empty silence we had lived in for years, but a full silence. A silence that held meaning. A silence that required presence. And in that silence, I realized something important. This wasn't sudden. It had been building for years. The only difference now was that I was no longer hiding from it. I looked at him calmly, without tension, without the need to justify myself, and said, "It's not sudden. You're just noticing it now." And those words didn't come from anger, they came from clarity, from a place that no longer needed approval, no longer needed to be understood in order to exist. He didn't respond right away. And that pause said everything. Because for the first time, he was being faced with something he couldn't dismiss. Something he couldn't control. Something that didn't bend to his expectations. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about change anymore. This was about transformation. And transformation doesn't ask for permission. After that conversation, something shifted in a deeper way, not just in the way we interacted, but in the energy of the house itself, like the illusion that had held everything together for so long had finally started to dissolve. And once that illusion begins to break, it doesn't quietly disappear. It exposes everything that was hidden beneath it. The silence between us was no longer neutral, it carried weight now. It was filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years, every expectation, every frustration, every moment where I chose to stay quiet instead of speaking up. And even though we weren't arguing, there was something much stronger present, truth, slowly rising to the surface whether we were ready for it or not. I could feel that he was watching me more closely now, paying attention to things he had never noticed before, like the way I moved through the house, the way I responded or didn't respond, the way I no longer adjusted automatically to his needs. And that awareness created a kind of tension that didn't need words to exist. It was there, constant, undeniable. There were moments when I could sense his frustration building, not expressed directly, but visible in small ways, in the way he dropped things, in the way he sighed, in the way he lingered as if waiting for something to happen, for me to return to what I used to be. And I could feel that old pull again, that familiar urge to restore comfort, to smooth things over, to make everything easier. But this time, I didn't give in. Not because I was trying to prove something. Not because I was trying to win. But because something inside me had finally reached a point where going back was no longer possible. I had seen too much. I had understood too much. And once you reach that point, you don't negotiate with what you know anymore. That night, I sat alone again, in the same place where so many of my thoughts had begun to change. And for the first time, I didn't feel confusion, I didn't feel hesitation, I didn't feel the need to question what I was doing. I felt something else. Certainty. A quiet, grounded certainty that didn't need validation, didn't need agreement, didn't need to be explained. And in that certainty, a decision was made. Not out loud, not dramatically, but clearly. I was no longer going to live the way I had been living. I was no longer going to carry what wasn't mine to carry. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it, because for the first time in years, I had chosen myself. The next morning didn't feel like a continuation of the same life I had been living, even though everything around me looked familiar, the same walls, the same furniture, the same routine waiting to repeat itself. There was something fundamentally different in the way I moved, in the way I thought, in the way I existed inside that space, like I was no longer reacting to my life. I was finally present in it. I woke up early as I always did, but this time there was no rush, no automatic urgency to prepare everything for someone else before thinking about myself. Instead, I sat in the quiet of the morning and allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space, real space, the kind that isn't filled with obligation or anticipation, just presence. When he woke up, everything unfolded the way it always had on the surface. He walked into the kitchen, looked around, waited for something to already be done, something to already be ready, and for a brief moment, there was that familiar pause, that expectation hanging in the air, waiting for me to step in and complete the pattern. But this time, nothing happened. I didn't move. I didn't adjust. I didn't fill the silence. I simply stayed where I was. Present. Unmoved. He looked at me, confusion turning into something else, something less certain, something that didn't have a clear direction yet, and for the first time I could see it clearly. He didn't know what to do without the version of me he had always relied on. And that moment stretched. Longer than any silence we had ever shared. Not empty. Not uncomfortable. But full. Full of everything that had been building, everything that had been changing, everything that was now undeniable. He didn't say anything. And neither did I. 'Cause for the first time, words weren't necessary. The pattern had already been broken. The dynamic had already shifted. And something new had already begun. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if he will change. I don't know if he will stay. Or if one day he will leave. But I know this. I am no longer living the same life. And whatever happens from here, it will no longer be built on silence. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if he will change. I don't know if he will stay. Or if one day he will leave. But I know this. I am no longer living the same life. And whatever happens from here, it will no longer be built on silence. And if you've ever felt like you were giving everything, and losing yourself in the process, then maybe it's time to stop, and ask yourself the same question I did. What am I still allowing? And if this story spoke to you, if you've lived something like this, make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes the hardest changes start in silence.